Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. We're going to be looking at some of the contextual and historical dynamics related to the surname Israel. And so we're going to look at the history of the usage of this surname, some information about the origins of the modern usage of this surname, where this surname has traveled to, and where this surname is most prevalent. And some of that might be rather surprising. We're going to continue with some other discussions about some other oddities related to other surnames and the historical usages of those surnames, but we're going to start off with these interesting dynamics related to the surname of Israel. This is just to make a quick notation related to surnames and how they are understood in terms of their historical context. And so you will generally be able to understand the origin of a surname in addition to its usage if you look at the history of it. And so here we have the surname Benjamin, which has a relationship to England and France in terms of usage, but there's also a notation that this surname is Hebrew in origin. And so that's important to keep in mind, that there is an indication of this as a Hebrew personal name. So there is an identification of that type of ethnicity in terms of where this name belongs. Now, before we get to talking about Israel and what has been noted related to that surname, we're just going to look at some other related surnames, because if you recall, prior to the name Israel, Jacob was named Jacob. And so it's an interesting story about how that name change occurred. But this is important because there is a history, this is a long-standing history here, of changing the names of people, changing the names of places. And so it creates quite a bit of confusion trying to keep up with all of these name changes, and a lack of clarity about why these names are changed so frequently. So there's a long history of this dynamic. So anyway, we have James, which of course is related to Jacob, and Iacobus or Iacov. So you see this name here very clearly. James has a Hebrew origin related to the word heal and related to the idea of being a supplanter. You also see that this name is related to the Doomsday Book. And so that's important to note in terms of the history of this name. So it's been around for a while in Europe in terms of it being a European surname. And here's additional information about the history of this surname James. And you see that it relates back to Surrey and Normandy, and also is related to South Wales and Monmouthshire. And this is where it turns a bit odd. And you see here the surname Jacobs. And this surname has origins coming out of Germany, Spain, Ireland, and England. And it's noted as an ancient Anglo-Saxon surname that came from the baptismal name Jacob. What's interesting here is that it is noted that in medieval times this surname was not related to individuals identified as Jewish, and so it was not seen as a Jewish surname, even though the surname James was identified as originating from the Hebrew. There's also some additional interesting history notations related to the Jacobs family surname that's coming out of Europe. And you can also see that in America that this surname was associated with the Salem witch trials of 1692. And so you can see there's a little bit of information down there about the trial of George Jacobs, August 5th of 1692. Now let's take a look at this name Israel in terms of a surname. So you can see that there's already an indication of certain surnames having a Hebrew origin and coming from certain parts of Europe in terms of the transplanting of the name and the moving around of the names. And so we looked at Benjamin, we looked at James, which is of course that Jacob derivative. And what was interesting is that James was seen as a Hebrew, a name of Hebrew origins, but Jacob was not necessarily as clearly indicated as such. And also the name Jacob was not immediately tied to that identity of being a Hebrew. And so now we have Israel, which is also slightly different in terms of its treatment. And so here you see that the early origins of the Israel family comes out of Venice. And so this is an oddity, given that Jacob is not also coming out of Venice, and James is not also coming out of Venice. And so this is supposed to be the same person with a shared name. But you see these different trajectories and different histories going on here. So it says the surname Israel was first found in Venice and a seaport. So that's interesting. And it's also important to note that during the time of the emergence of this name, that only individuals of a particular rank were entered into records according to their surnames. And so this would include those of nobility, clergy, city officials, podesta, artists, landowners. And here you see the spelling variations for this name Israel. And what's interesting is that if you look at that second translation, that second spelling, it actually is Ishmael. And so you see Israel, and then you see what looks like Ishmaeli, looks like Ishmael. Then you see Israel with a Z as opposed to an S. Then you see Yisrael with a Y. Then you see Israelski and Israeler. You go on down further, you see Israeli, Yisraeli. But what is really noteworthy is that Ishmaeli, that appears to be a variation of Israel. And so that's an interesting notation. Okay, so what else is also interesting about the Israel settler name is that there's an indication that this surname came in as a colonizer. And you see this continuing on. So you see very early on, 1664. And then you see this surname continuing in the colonizer status into the 1800s. You see Enrique Israel landing in Jamaica in 1740. And here are other oddities related to this surname Israel. You can see here that given its history, it's really interesting that it is most prevalent in Tanzania. And so you see 17,000 individuals with this surname in Tanzania. And then second, you see Nigeria with over 15,000. And then in third place, the United States, followed by Ethiopia and the Philippines and Haiti. In fact, Haiti has the highest density of individuals with the surname Israel. Now it would be very interesting to know how these different groups of people came upon this particular surname. Was this passed down? Did it pass down through those Italian origins in terms of usage? Was this name adopted? How did people come to use this name across all of these different land spaces, these different continents? And finally, we have some transliterations of the name Israel. And what's also interesting is that you can see when you look at the translation and you go into Hebrew, you can see readily that Sarah word embedded in there, but you also see Esau, and Esau is usually related to Jesus. And so it's very interesting to see that in one language for the name Israel. Not only do you have this dynamic, you also have a dynamic where some people identify the name Israel as not only being related to this idea of supplanter, but also there's an assertion that the name, when broken down, is related to Egyptian gods and goddesses. And so you have that beginning, Israel, you have Isis, Ra, and El or El. An important takeaway for people understanding the history of this surname and the usage or adoption of the surname or the passing of the surname is that people need to be conscious of the histories of these names that people are using or people are adopting. Be very conscious of that and do a little bit of homework on these names that are being used, particularly if someone's changing their name from their family name to use this name. It's important to get a better understanding of the history of this name, the transliterations of the name, the usage of the name, and in some instances, as many people are claiming all sorts of historic identities, some people might want to start thinking about whether a paternity test is necessary. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.